Before we begin tonight's story, I want to know where you're listening from. Whether you're in London, Paris, New York, Los Angeles, Madrid, Berlin, or anywhere else in the world, take a moment and leave a comment telling me your city. And if you're new here, please subscribe. This channel is dedicated to bringing you thoroughly researched true crime stories told in a way that helps you drift peacefully into sleep. Tonight's story is about a mystery that has haunted France and Britain for over a decade. A family vacation that turned into an international investigation. A case with no clear motive, no confirmed suspect, and more questions than answers. September 5th, 2012. The French Alps. Lake Annecy glimmers in the late summer sun, surrounded by mountains and forests. It's a place of extraordinary beauty, a destination for tourists seeking tranquility and natural splendor. On a quiet forest road near the village of Cheveline, a British family sits in their burgundy BMW, taking in the peaceful surroundings. Within moments, that peace will be shattered by gunfire, for people will be dead, 2 young children will survive, and an investigation will begin that continues to this day, more than 12 years later, with no resolution in sight. This is the story of the Annecy shootings, also known as the Cheveline massacre. A story of execution-style murders, international intrigue, family disputes, and theories that range from professional assassination to random violence. A story that asks us to consider what happened on that remote mountain road, and why, after thousands of investigative hours and countless leads, no one has ever been charged with these murders. To understand what happened on September 5th, 2012, we must first understand the people involved. The Al-Hilli family were British citizens living in Claygate, a village in Surrey, about 20 miles southwest of London. Claygate is a prosperous area, the kind of place where families settle to raise children in a safe, comfortable environment. Saad Al-Hilli was 50 years old in 2012. He had been born in Baghdad, Iraq, in 1962. His father, Kadim Al-Hilli, was a skilled jeweler and businessman who had established a successful career in Iraq. But in the late 1970s, as Iraq became increasingly unstable under Saddam Hussein's regime, the family made the difficult decision to leave. They immigrated to Britain, seeking safety and opportunity. Saad thrived in his new country. He studied engineering, specializing in satellite technology and aerospace. He worked as a design engineer, creating technical drawings for satellite systems. His work was precise, detail-oriented, and dealt with complex mechanical systems. For much of his career, he worked for companies involved in defense and aerospace, including time at the Rutherford Appleton Laboratory in Oxfordshire, a facility that conducts space research. By 2012, Saad was working as a freelance consultant from his home in Surrey. He had contracts with various companies, including EADS Astrium, a major European aerospace corporation that built satellites and defense systems. His work was technical, but it was not classified at the highest levels. He did not have access to state secrets, despite what some media reports would later suggest. He was a skilled engineer doing commercial work in the aerospace industry. Saad married Iqbal Al-Safar in the late 1990s. Iqbal was 47 in 2012. She had been born in Iraq but had grown up largely in the United States before moving to Britain. She was trained as a dentist, though by the time of her death, she was focused primarily on raising the couple's 2 daughters. Iqbal was described by those who knew her as warm, devoted to her family, and deeply religious. She wore a hijab and was active in the local Muslim community. Saad and Iqbal had 2 daughters. Zainab was 7 years old in September 2012. She was bright, articulate, and loved school. Her younger sister, Zina, was 4. Both girls attended local schools in Surrey and were growing up in a loving, stable home. The family lived in a semi-detached house in Claygate that Saad owned jointly with his brother, Zaid. The house had been inherited from their father, Kadim, who had passed away in 2011. The brothers' relationship had become strained in the year following their father's death, a fact that would later become significant to the investigation. In late August 2012, the Al-Hilli family decided to take a vacation to the French Alps. They packed their burgundy BMW estate car onto a ferry and crossed the English Channel. Their destination was Lake-on-Sea, one of the most beautiful lakes in Europe, located in the Haute-Savoie region of southeastern France. Lake-on-Sea is known for its crystal-clear waters, surrounded by mountains and medieval villages. The area is popular with hikers, cyclists, and families seeking a peaceful retreat. The Al-Hillis set up camp at a lakeside campsite near the town of St. Georgios. They brought their caravan with them, planning to spend about 2 weeks enjoying the scenery, taking day trips into the mountains, and relaxing as a family. Joining them on the trip was Iqbal's mother, Suhaila Al-Alaf. Suhaila was 74 years old and held a Swedish passport, having lived in Sweden for many years. She had traveled to Britain to visit her daughter and had decided to accompany the family on their French vacation. Suhaila was a grandmother who doted on Zainab and Zina, and the trip was an opportunity for her to spend quality time with them. The family's vacation proceeded peacefully. They explored the area around Lake-on-Sea, took photographs, and enjoyed the warm late summer weather. Saad was known to be interested in maps and routes, and he liked to plan excursions to interesting or scenic locations. On September 4th, the day before the murders, witnesses at the campsite later recalled seeing Saad engaged in a heated conversation with an unidentified man. The man had come to visit Saad at the campsite, and their discussion appeared tense. The identity of this man has never been established, and he never came forward after the murders. On the morning of September 5th, Saad asked his daughter Zainab what she would like to do that day. She could choose between going shopping in the town of Annecy or going for a walk in the forest. Zainab chose the walk, and so, after lunch, the family piled into their BMW and set off toward the mountains. The route they chose took them away from the lake, up into the hills above the village of Cheveline. Cheveline is a small hamlet, quiet and picturesque, perched on the slopes overlooking Lake-on-Sea. From Cheveline, a narrow forest road called the Route Forestière de Ménil de la Combe d'Aire winds up into the woods. This road is used by hikers, cyclists, and forestry vehicles. It's a peaceful place, shaded by trees, with occasional clearings offering views of the surrounding mountains. The Al-Hilli family drove up this forest road, perhaps looking for a scenic spot to stop and enjoy the afternoon. At around 3:30 p.m., their car pulled into a small levee, a widened area of the road where vehicles can park. The levee is located about 5 kilometers up the forest road from Cheveline, in a secluded area surrounded by trees. There are no houses nearby, no other buildings, just forest and mountain trails. What happened next remains, in many ways, a mystery. But what we know for certain is that sometime around 3:45 p.m., someone approached the Al-Hilli family and opened fire. At approximately 3:50 p.m., a French cyclist named Sylvain Mallier was riding his bike along the same forest road. Sylvain was 45 years old, a local man who lived in the nearby town of Eugene. He worked as a welder at a factory owned by Cesis, a subsidiary of Areva, a company involved in nuclear energy production. Sylvain was married with 3 children, and he was an avid cyclist who often rode in the mountains around Annecy. As Sylvain approached the levee where the Al-Hilli family's car was parked, he encountered a scene of violence. The exact sequence of events is unclear, but forensic evidence suggests that Sylvain either arrived during the attack or immediately after it began. He was shot multiple times. 5 bullets struck his body. He fell from his bike and collapsed on the road, just meters from the BMW. Inside the car, the violence was even more devastating. Saad Al-Hilli was in the driver's seat. He had been shot twice in the head at close range. Iqbal, his wife, was in the front passenger seat. She too had been shot twice in the head. In the back seat, Suhaila Al-Alaf, Iqbal's mother, had also been shot twice in the head. All 3 adults were dead, killed execution style with precision and speed. But the 2 children were alive. 7-year-old Zainab had been outside the car when the shooting began. She had been shot in the shoulder and struck repeatedly on the head with the butt of the gun, suffering a fractured skull. She was left on the ground near the car, gravely injured but still breathing. 4-year-old Zina had been in the back seat of the car. When the shooting started, She instinctively hid, squeezing herself into the footwell behind her mother's seat, beneath her mother's legs. She remained there, silent and terrified, as the gunman fired into the car. Somehow, Zina was not hit. She stayed hidden in the footwell for the next 8 hours, surrounded by the bodies of her dead family members, too frightened to move or make a sound. At around 4 p.m., another cyclist, a British man named Brett Martin, was descending the forest road on his bike. Brett was on vacation in the area and had spent the afternoon cycling in the mountains. As he rode down the road toward Cheveline, he came upon the levee and saw what he thought was a car accident. A burgundy BMW was parked at an odd angle. A man was lying on the ground near a bicycle. Brett slowed down and called out, asking if anyone needed help. As he got closer, he saw more. The man on the ground was clearly dead, his body surrounded by blood. Brett looked into the car and saw bodies slumped in the seats. He saw a young girl, Zainab, lying on the ground near the car, moaning in pain. Brett immediately realized this was not an accident. This was a crime scene. He pulled out his phone, but there was no signal in the remote forest location. He needed to get help. He flagged down another cyclist who was coming up the road, a Frenchman. Brett told him what he had found and asked him to ride down to the village to call the police while Brett stayed with the injured girl. Brett knelt beside Zainab, trying to comfort her. She was semi-conscious, in shock, bleeding from her wounds. Brett did not move her, fearing he might worsen her injuries. He waited, alone in the forest with the bodies and the dying child, until help arrived. It took about 50 minutes for the first police officers to reach the scene. The remote location and the narrow road made access difficult. When the gendarmes arrived, they secured the area and called for emergency medical assistance and forensic investigators. Zainab was carefully lifted onto a stretcher and taken by helicopter to a hospital in Grenoble, where doctors worked to save her life. But it was not until much later, around midnight, that investigators discovered 4-year-old Zina. She had remained hidden in the footwell of the car for over 8 hours, paralyzed by fear, not making a sound even as police and forensic technicians worked around the vehicle. It was only when a specialist forensic team began a detailed examination of the car's interior that they found her, still alive, still hiding beneath her mother's body. The discovery of the bodies sent shockwaves through France and Britain. The murder of a family, including an elderly woman, in broad daylight on a public road was almost unheard of in this peaceful region. The execution-style nature of the killings, with each adult shot twice in the head, suggested a level of planning and cold-bloodedness that was deeply disturbing. The French authorities launched an immediate and extensive investigation. The Annecy prosecutor at the time, Eric Maillard, took charge of the case. Maillard was an experienced prosecutor, but he had never dealt with a crime of this magnitude. The case would come to define his career, and his handling of the investigation would be both praised and heavily criticized in the years to come. Forensic teams descended on the levee. The scene was photographed, measured, and searched for evidence. Shell casings from the bullets were found scattered on the ground. The weapon used was a 7.65mm pistol, an older type of firearm, possibly a Swiss-made Luger or a similar model. The casings indicated that 25 shots had been fired in total. This was a significant detail. The shooter had not fired randomly or in a panic. They had methodically shot each adult twice in the head, emptied additional rounds into Sylvain Mollier's body, and fired at Zainab when she tried to flee. The question that immediately arose was, who was the target? Was this a planned assassination of the Al-Hili family, with Sylvain Mollier simply an unlucky bystander who stumbled upon the scene? Or was Mollier the target, and the Al-Hilis the collateral damage? If you're still awake and listening to this story, I'd love to know what time it is where you are. Are you listening late at night trying to fall asleep? Or perhaps it's early morning where you are, and you're winding down after a long day. Whatever time it is, whatever city you're in, thank you for being here. If you're finding this story helpful for sleep, please consider subscribing and sharing this with others who might enjoy it. And now, let's continue with the investigation into the Annecy shootings. The investigation quickly expanded to examine the backgrounds of all the victims. Who were these people? What might have motivated someone to kill them? The focus initially centered on Saad al-Hili. As an Iraqi-born engineer who had worked in the aerospace industry, including time at facilities involved in defense research, Saad seemed like the most likely target for an assassination. Investigators began looking into his professional life, his financial affairs, and his personal relationships. One of the first significant discoveries was that Saad had been involved in a dispute with his brother, Zaid al-Hili. The dispute centered on their father's estate. When Qadim al-Hili died in 2011, he left behind property in Britain and a bank account in Switzerland containing hundreds of thousands of euros. Saad and Zaid were joint inheritors, but their relationship had deteriorated over the division of assets. Phone records examined by police revealed heated conversations between the brothers in the months leading up to the murders. There were disagreements about the house in Claygate, which the brothers owned jointly. There were also questions about the Swiss bank account. Saad had visited Geneva, just a short drive from Annecy, a few days before his death. He had met with bank officials regarding the account. In October 2013, Zaid al-Hili was arrested in Britain on suspicion of conspiracy to commit murder. The arrest made headlines. Police searched his home and questioned him extensively. But the evidence against Zaid was circumstantial at best. There was no proof he had hired anyone to kill his brother. There was no evidence placing him in France at the time of the murders. His phone records showed he had been in Britain on September 5th. After months of investigation, British authorities announced in January 2014 that there was insufficient evidence to charge Zaid, and he was released. Zaid has always maintained his innocence. He has stated publicly that while he and Saad had disagreements, he loved his brother and would never have harmed him. The idea that he would have ordered the murder of his entire family, including 2 young nieces and an elderly woman he had no dispute with, seemed implausible. And yet, the family feud remained one of the central theories of the case. Another line of inquiry focused on Saad's professional work. Had he been involved in something sensitive, something that might have led foreign intelligence agencies or rival companies to target him? This theory gained traction in the media, with some outlets suggesting that Saad had access to classified information or had stumbled upon industrial secrets worth killing for. But as investigators dug deeper, this theory began to fall apart. Saad's work, while technical, was not classified. He had not been employed at the Rutherford Appleton Laboratory for several years, and his work there had been in satellite design, not weapons systems. His freelance contracts with companies like EADS Astrium were commercial in nature. There was no evidence that he possessed sensitive information that would justify an assassination. Moreover, if Saad had been targeted by professional killers, it seemed unlikely they would have chosen such a public location or such a haphazard method. A professional hit would typically be cleaner, more discreet. The Annecy shootings were brutal and messy, with multiple victims and a child left as a witness. This did not fit the profile of a sophisticated assassination. The investigation then turned to Sylvain Mallier, the French cyclist. Was it possible that he, not the al-Hili family, had been the intended target? Sylvain worked at a factory that produced components for nuclear reactors. Could he have been involved in industrial espionage or have possessed information that someone wanted silenced? Investigators looked closely at Sylvain's life. They discovered that he had a somewhat complicated personal situation. He had recently married his second wife, Claire Schutz. Claire's family owned a successful pharmacy business worth millions of euros. There were tensions within Claire's family about the business and about Sylvain's role in it. Additionally, Sylvain had children from a previous relationship, and there were custody and financial disagreements. One person of interest was a former boyfriend of Sylvain's sister. This man was a former French foreign legionnaire who owned a collection of firearms and lived in the area. He was questioned by police, but there was no evidence linking him to the crime. He had an alibi for the time of the murders, and forensic tests did not connect him to the scene. Despite extensive investigation, no motive was found for someone to want Sylvain dead. His work at the factory was routine, not sensitive. His personal life, while complicated, did not involve the kind of animosity that would lead to murder. And the theory that Sylvain was the target raised a difficult question. If the killer was waiting for Sylvain on that forest road, how could they have known he would be there? Sylvain's decision to cycle that route on that particular day was spontaneous. It seemed highly unlikely that someone could have predicted his presence. As the investigation continued, another crucial piece of evidence emerged: the description of a motorcyclist seen near the crime scene. Several witnesses reported seeing a man on a motorcycle in the area around the time of the murders. The motorcycle was described as a large bike, possibly a BMW or similar model. The rider was wearing a distinctive helmet, which some witnesses described as having unusual features or markings. British police worked with French authorities to create a composite sketch of the motorcyclist. The sketch showed a man with a goatee beard wearing motorcycle gear. This image was released to the public in an appeal for information. The motorcyclist became the prime suspect, the elusive figure who might hold the key to solving the case. In 2013, a man came forward in response to the appeal. He was a motorcyclist who had been in the area on September 5, 2012. He explained that he had been riding in the mountains and had passed near the forest road where the murders occurred. Police questioned him extensively, examined his motorcycle, and checked his alibi. After investigation, he was cleared of involvement. His motorcycle did not match the description given by witnesses, and he had a solid account of his movements that day. But the search for the motorcyclist continued. In February 2014, police arrested a former French police officer who lived in a small village near Chevaline. This man, described in the media as something of a loner, owned motorcycles and firearms. His arrest generated significant media attention. But within days, he too was released. He was charged with illegal weapons possession but not with the murders. There was no evidence linking him to the crime scene. In September 2021, 9 years after the murders, police made another arrest. A man was detained in connection with the case, and reports suggested that investigators believed they had finally found the killer. But once again, within 48 hours, the suspect was released without charge. The evidence was insufficient. The investigation has been hampered by several factors. One of the most significant was the contamination of the crime scene. In the hours after the murders, before forensic teams arrived, the area around the Labie was not properly secured. People walked through the scene. Evidence may have been moved or lost. This early mishandling made it more difficult to reconstruct exactly what happened and to identify the perpetrator. Another issue was the lack of CCTV coverage in the area. The remote forest road had no cameras. While police reviewed footage from cameras along the route the Al-Hili family had taken from their campsite to Chevaline, there was no video of anyone following them. This suggested that either the killer had been waiting at the Labie, or they had approached the scene without being captured on any cameras along major roads. The weapon used in the murders has never been found. Without the gun, it is impossible to trace its ownership or connect it definitively to a suspect. Ballistics analysis showed that the pistol was an older model, possibly from the 1940s or 1950s, and may have been military surplus weapon. Such guns are relatively common in Europe, particularly in Switzerland and France, where military weapons from the world wars were sold off or passed down through families. One of the most poignant aspects of the case is the survival and testimony of Zainab Al-Hili. After being airlifted to the hospital in Grenoble, Zainab underwent surgery for her injuries. She had been shot in the shoulder and had suffered skull fractures from being beaten with the gun. Doctors worked to save her life, and after several weeks, she recovered enough to speak with investigators. Zainab told police that she had seen one bad man. She described a man with a dark complexion, possibly wearing a helmet or a hat. She said the man had shot her father and then had come after her when she tried to run. She had been hit and fell to the ground. Beyond these basic details, her memory of the event was understandably fragmented and traumatic. 4-year-old Zina, who had hidden in the car, was unable to provide any useful information. She had not seen the attacker. She only remembered being terrified and hiding. Both girls were eventually returned to Britain, where they were placed in the care of family members. Their identities and whereabouts have been protected to shield them from media attention. The girls' survival is both a blessing and a tragedy. They are alive, but they have lost their parents and grandmother in the most horrific way imaginable. They will carry the trauma of that day for the rest of their lives, and they are the only direct witnesses to a crime that remains unsolved. Over the years, numerous theories have been proposed to explain the Annecy shootings. Some are grounded in the evidence. Others are speculative, bordering on conspiracy theories. Let's examine the main possibilities. Theory 1. A family feud assassination. This theory holds that Saad al-Hili was the target, killed because of the dispute with his brother Zaid over their father's inheritance. According to this theory, Zaid hired a contract killer to eliminate Saad. The killer waited on the forest road, knowing that Saad would eventually drive by, and executed him along with his family to eliminate witnesses. But this theory has significant problems. Zaid was never charged, and no evidence of him hiring a killer was ever found. Moreover, it seems implausible that a contract killer would choose such a public location and such a violent method, especially when it meant killing children and an elderly woman. Theory 2. Industrial espionage or intelligence. This theory suggests that Saad was targeted because of his work in the aerospace industry. Perhaps he had access to information that a foreign government or rival company wanted suppressed. Or perhaps he was mistakenly believed to have such information. But as noted, Saad's work was not classified, and no evidence of espionage has been found. This theory gained traction in the media but has not been supported by the investigation. Theory 3. Sylvain Mollier was the target. This theory proposes that the French cyclist, not the al-Hili family, was the intended victim. Perhaps Mollier was involved in something criminal or had made an enemy who wanted him dead. The al-Hilis simply had the misfortune of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But this theory faces the same problem. Investigators have found no motive for anyone to want Mollier dead, and it seems unlikely that a killer would be waiting for him on a road he rarely used. Theory 4. A random psychopath. This theory holds that the killer was not targeting anyone specifically but was simply a violent individual who decided to commit murder. Perhaps the killer was mentally disturbed, had recently suffered a traumatic event, or was testing themselves to see if they could kill. This theory is supported by the forensic psychological profile that was commissioned in 2020, which suggested the killer might be someone with a personality disorder, a history of failure, and possibly a criminal record. But this theory does not explain how the killer knew to be on that forest road at that time, or why they chose to shoot multiple people rather than a single victim. Theory 5. A combination or mistaken identity. Some investigators believe the truth might lie in a combination of factors or a case of mistaken identity. Perhaps the killer was waiting for someone else and mistook the al-Hili car for their intended target. Or perhaps the al-Hilis witnessed something criminal in the area, and the killer eliminated them to prevent them from reporting it. These theories remain speculative, with no concrete evidence to support them. In recent years, there have been some developments in the case, though none have led to an arrest. In 2017, investigators began looking into possible connections between the Annecy shootings and other unsolved murders in the region. There had been a series of killings in eastern France involving firearms, and some wondered if they might be the work of the same perpetrator. But no definitive links have been established. In 2020, the psychological profile of the killer was completed by a British forensic psychiatrist. The profile suggested that the shooter was likely a man between 30 and 40 years old at the time of the murders, possibly unemployed or in a low-status job, living alone, and with a history of difficulty in social relationships. The profile also suggested that the killer might have a criminal record and could have been subjected to childhood abuse or trauma. This profile has been used to narrow the search for suspects, but it has not yet led to an identification. In October 2024, French investigators conducted a reconstruction of the crime at a disused airbase. Actors played the roles of the victims and the suspected shooter. The reconstruction was designed to test various theories about the sequence of events and to see if new insights could be gained. The results of this reconstruction have not yet been made public, but prosecutors have described it as a useful exercise that has generated new avenues of inquiry. As of today, the Annecy shootings remain officially unsolved. The case is still active, with a team of 6 gendarmes continuing to work on it. The current prosecutor, Line Bonnet Mathis, has stated that the case is far from cold, and that she is confident it will eventually be solved, particularly as forensic science continues to advance. DNA samples were taken from the crime scene, including from the car and from the victim's clothing. However, no usable DNA from the killer has been identified. The hope is that as DNA analysis techniques improve, it may become possible to extract and identify genetic material that was previously undetectable. The families of the victims have lived with the pain of these unsolved murders for over 12 years. Saad al-Hilli's brother, Zaid, despite being cleared of suspicion, has had his reputation permanently damaged by the public speculation about his involvement. He has spoken of the anguish of losing his brother and of being accused of orchestrating his murder. Sylvain Mollier's widow, Claire, has also endured the loss and the endless speculation about whether her husband was somehow involved in something that led to his death. She has maintained that Sylvain was an innocent man who was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. And Zainab and Zina al-Hilli, now young women, have grown up without their parents. Their lives were irrevocably changed on that September afternoon in the French Alps. One can only hope that they have found some measure of peace and healing, even as the mystery of what happened to their family remains unresolved. As we near the end of the story, I want to thank you for listening. If you've made it this far, you're either deeply engaged in this mystery or you've found comfort in the sound of my voice and the gentle rain. Whatever brought you here tonight, I'm grateful for your presence. If this story has helped you relax or sleep, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to this channel. Your support helps me continue creating these deeply researched stories. And if there's a particular case you'd like me to cover, leave a comment. I read every one. The Annecy shootings represent a particularly frustrating type of unsolved crime. There are no clear suspects. There is no obvious motive. The evidence, while extensive, points in multiple directions without converging on a single theory. And yet, somewhere, the answer exists. Someone knows what happened on that forest road. The killer, whoever they are, is still out there. They have lived with the knowledge of what they did for over 12 years. Perhaps they have told no one. Perhaps they have confessed to someone who has kept the secret. Perhaps they have died, taking the truth with them to the grave. Or perhaps one day they will be identified, arrested, and brought to justice. The case reminds us that some crimes, no matter how extensively investigated, resist solution. The randomness of violence, the limitations of evidence, and the passage of time all conspire to leave questions unanswered. But the investigation continues. New leads are pursued, new technologies are applied, and the hope remains that the mystery of the Annecy shootings will one day be solved. What do we know for certain about the events of September 5, 2012? We know that a British family and a French cyclist were murdered on a remote forest road near Lake Annecy. We know that the killer used a 7.65mm pistol and fired 25 shots. We know that the murders were brutal and methodical, with each adult shot twice in the head. We know that 2 young girls survived, one by hiding and one by chance. And we know that despite an extensive international investigation involving British and French authorities, no one has been charged with these murders. What we don't know is why. Why were these people killed? What was the motive? Was this a planned assassination or a random act of violence? Was there a single perpetrator or were there accomplices? Did the killer know the victims or were they strangers? These questions have haunted investigators for over a decade. They have generated countless theories, hundreds of interviews, and thousands of hours of forensic analysis. And yet, the answers remain elusive. The Annecy shootings are a reminder that in the modern world, even with all our technology and investigative techniques, some mysteries endure. Some crimes remain unsolved. Some questions remain unanswered. And some families must live with grief and uncertainty, waiting for a resolution that may never come. Let the sound of the rain carry you now toward rest. Let the unanswered questions fade into the background. The investigation continues, but for tonight, for this moment, let yourself drift. The mountains around Lake-on-Sea remain beautiful. The forest roads are still traveled by cyclists and hikers. Life goes on even in the shadow of tragedy. Saad, Iqbal, Suhaila, and Sylvain have not been forgotten. Their names are remembered. Their case is still active. And somewhere, perhaps, the truth waits to be discovered. But for now, as the rain falls softly and the night deepens, rest. Let sleep come gently. Let peace find you. Thank you for listening. Good night. Story 2. Nantes, France. April 21st, 2011. Affluent neighborhood. Manicured lawns. Quiet streets. The kind of place where nothing terrible ever happens. Until it does. 5 people vanished without a trace. A mother, for children, ages 13 to 21. Their bodies hidden beneath their own home. And the father, the husband, the prime suspect, disappeared into thin air. If you're fascinated by cases that defy explanation, cases where the monster next door was hiding in plain sight, then stay with us. Because what happened in that house on Rue de l'Erdre will haunt you long after this story ends. Asterisk asterisk. This is the story of the Dupont de Ligons family, and the man who may have committed the perfect escape. Xavier Pierre-Marie Dupont de Ligons. Born January 9, 1961. A man who wore his aristocratic name like armor. The de in his surname marked him as nobility, or at least that's what he wanted people to believe. He grew up in Versailles, raised in a family that valued appearances above all else. Private schools, Catholic traditions, the veneer of old French wealth, even if the bank account didn't always match the pedigree. In 1992, Xavier married Agnes Hodanger. She was intelligent, warm, beloved by those who knew her. They were a golden couple, at least on the surface. Together, they would have 4 children: Arthur, Thomas, Anne, and Benoit. The family settled in Nantes, in the Pays de la Loire region of western France, a city of almost 300,000 people. Historic, beautiful, the kind of place where families put down roots. Their home at 55 Boulevard Robert Schumann, later moved to Rue de l'Erdre, became the center of their world. Xavier worked in business, though his ventures were often more ambition than success. Agnes worked as a secretary at a Catholic school. The children attended good schools, played sports, had friends. From the outside, they were perfect, but inside that home, cracks were forming. Financial pressure, Xavier's failed business ventures, the weight of maintaining an image that cost more than they could afford. By 2011, those cracks had become chasms. If you're invested in this case, if you want to understand what really happened in Nantes, keep watching. Because the truth is more disturbing than you can imagine. Asterisk asterisk. Early April 2011. Life at the Dupont de Ligons home appeared normal. The children went to school. Agnes went to work. Xavier was planning something. On April 3rd, neighbors noticed something odd. The family's 2 Labrador dogs were missing. Xavier told people he'd sent them to stay with friends. The truth was far darker. He'd taken them to a veterinary clinic and had them euthanized. The official reason: they were old and sick. They weren't. On April 11th, Xavier purchased a .22 rifle with a suppressor from a gun shop in Nantes. He told the clerk he needed it for target practice. The suppressor, he said, was to avoid disturbing his neighbors. That same week, he bought 40 liters of lime, shovels, and large plastic tarps. Between April 3rd and April 5th, something unthinkable happened in that house. The exact sequence remains uncertain, but the evidence tells a horrific story. One by one, members of the Dupont de Ligons family were shot in the head as they slept. Agnes, 48 years old, Arthur, 21, Thomas, 18, and 16, Benoit, 13. Each victim was shot twice, once in the head, then a second shot to ensure death. The rifle was placed against their heads, the suppressor muffling the sound to little more than a muted crack. After each killing, Xavier wrapped the bodies in sheets and plastic. He dragged them, one by one, into the rear terrace room of the house. Then he began to dig. Beneath the terrace, in the confined crawl space, he excavated a shallow grave. He poured lime over the bodies to accelerate decomposition and mask the smell. Then he covered the hole with concrete tiles, creating a makeshift tomb beneath the floor where his family had walked just days before. The physical effort alone was staggering. Moving 5 bodies, digging in a cramped space, the psychological calculation required to kill your own children in their sleep. And then Xavier went about his life as if nothing had happened. Stay with us, because what Xavier did next shows a level of premeditation that chills investigators to this day. Asterisk asterisk. On April 6th, Xavier sent a letter to the family's friends and the children's schools. The message was carefully crafted. The family was relocating to Australia for his work. They were leaving immediately. They wouldn't be reachable for several weeks while they settled in. He forged Agnes's signature on documents. He sent emails from her account. He even had mail forwarded to an address in southwest France that he'd control. For 2 weeks, Xavier lived alone in that house. Above the grave containing his wife and children, he cleaned, he organized, he prepared. Neighbors saw him coming and going. He seemed normal, calm. One neighbor even had a brief conversation with him about the family's upcoming move. On April 11th, Xavier checked into the Formule 1 budget hotel in Rouen, about 350 kilometers northeast of Nantes. He paid in cash. He kept to himself. On April 12th, he checked out. On April 14th, Xavier was captured on CCTV at a post office in Roquebrune-sur-Argens, in southern France near the Mediterranean coast. He was mailing letters, wearing a baseball cap, calm, methodical. That's the last confirmed sighting of Xavier Dupont de Ligons. On April 15th, someone, almost certainly Xavier, dumped the family's car, a Peugeot 607, in a parking lot at the Hotel Formule 1 in Roquebrune. The car was found days later. Inside, nothing of value, no clues. It had been wiped clean. And Xavier? He vanished. April 21st, 2011. 10 days after Xavier's last confirmed appearance. The Catholic school where Agnes worked was concerned. She hadn't shown up for work. She hadn't called. This wasn't like her. Colleagues tried calling. No answer. They contacted relatives. The relatives tried the home. Nothing. Finally, friends went to the house on Rue de l'Erdre. They knocked. No response. They peered through windows. The house looked empty but undisturbed. They called the police. When officers entered the home, they found it eerily clean. Too clean. The kind of clean that raises alarm bells. In the master bedroom, investigators found something disturbing. Bullet casings. Shell casings from a .22 rifle. Then they found the letters. Typed letters addressed to family and friends, explaining the move to Australia. But something about them felt wrong. The tone, the details, they didn't sound like Agnes. Officers continued searching. The rear terrace room. Concrete tiles on the floor. And beneath those tiles, the smell. When they lifted the tiles and excavated the shallow grave, they found them. All 5 members of the Dupont de Ligons family, wrapped in plastic and sheets, covered in lime, shot in the head. The children were still in their pajamas. The scene was methodical, planned, executed with a chilling efficiency that spoke of premeditation. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was an annihilation, carefully plotted and carried out by the one person who should have protected them. Xavier Dupont de Ligons became France's most wanted man overnight. If you're still with us, stay tuned, because the investigation that followed uncovered layers of deception that spanned decades and continents. Within hours, investigators began piecing together Xavier's movements. They found receipts from the gun purchase, security footage from hotels, witness statements from clerks and neighbors. They learned about Xavier's financial troubles. He was deep in debt, over 200,000 euros. He'd been lying to Agnes about his business ventures for years. He'd invested in failed schemes, borrowed money he couldn't repay, and maintained a lifestyle his income couldn't support. But investigators also found something stranger. Evidence that Xavier had been researching how to disappear, how to forge documents, how to survive off the grid. In the weeks before the murders, he'd been visiting websites about new identities and life insurance policies. He'd researched poison, rifles, and human decomposition. The working theory emerged quickly. Xavier had killed his family to escape his financial ruin. Rather than face bankruptcy and shame, he'd eliminated his dependents and fled. A twisted logic that valued pride over human life. But where did he go? Phone records showed Xavier's cell phone was last active on April 14th in Roquebrune-sur-Argens. After that, silence. No more credit card transactions. No more phone activity. No ATM withdrawals. Either Xavier Dupont de Ligons was dead, or he'd successfully vanished. Investigators pursued both possibilities with equal vigor. The manhunt for Xavier Dupont de Ligons became one of the largest and longest in French history. Interpol issued a red notice. His face appeared on wanted posters across Europe and beyond. Tips flooded in from around the world. Xavier had been spotted in Argentina, in Scotland, in Montreal, in Thailand. Each lead was investigated. Each sighting proved false. Theories multiplied. Some believed Xavier had fled to South America, following a route similar to other fugitives. Others thought he'd gone to Italy or Spain, countries with large Catholic communities where a French aristocrat might blend in. One theory held particular weight among investigators: suicide. In the weeks after the murders, French authorities conducted extensive searches of the forests and mountainous regions near Roquebrune-sur-Argens. The Var region is vast, filled with dense woodlands and isolated trails. The perfect place to disappear permanently. Xavier had purchased a tent, camping supplies, and a guide to Benedictine monasteries shortly before his disappearance. Some investigators believed he'd walked into the wilderness with the intention of dying there, perhaps as a twisted form of penance or escape. Despite massive searches, including helicopters, search dogs, and ground teams, no body was ever found. No campsite, no evidence he'd ever been in those woods at all. This is where the case becomes truly strange. Stay with us as we explore the bizarre twists that kept this investigation alive for over a decade. In 2015, a new lead emerged. A photo from a missing persons database showed a man in a monastery in Tuscany, Italy, who bore a striking resemblance to Xavier. Investigators followed the lead, traveling to the monastery and interviewing monks. The man turned out to be someone else entirely. In 2019, the case exploded back into headlines. A man was arrested at Glasgow Airport in Scotland after facial recognition software flagged him as a potential match for Xavier Dupont de Ligons. The French public held its breath. Media outlets went into overdrive. DNA testing was rushed through. The world waited. It wasn't him. The man was a completely innocent traveler who happened to share some facial features with France's most wanted fugitive. In 2019, another theory gained traction. Xavier had help. Investigators began looking into whether members of his extended family or social circle had assisted his escape. After all, disappearing completely requires resources, connections, and planning. Xavier's aristocratic background meant he had connections across France and Europe. French authorities investigated family members, old friends, and business associates. They found nothing concrete, but suspicions remained. How could one man vanish so completely without assistance? The Catholic connection also drew scrutiny. Xavier was deeply religious, raised in traditional Catholic circles. Some investigators theorized he'd found refuge in Catholic institutions, monasteries, or religious communities that might shield him out of misplaced sympathy or religious obligation. Monasteries in France, Italy, Spain, and even South America were contacted and investigated. Again, nothing. By 2020, nearly a decade after the murders, the investigation had slowed but never stopped. French law has no statute of limitations on murder. Xavier Dupont de Ligons would be pursued until found, whether alive or dead. In 2022, New forensic technology allowed investigators to re-examine evidence from the house. Advanced DNA analysis, digital forensics, and reconstructions of Xavier's online activity in the weeks before the murders provided new insights but no new location. One chilling discovery. In the weeks before the killings, Xavier had been researching his own family tree, going back generations. As if he were saying goodbye to his lineage, his history, or perhaps preparing to erase it entirely. Today, more than a decade later, the fate of Xavier Dupont de Ligons remains one of France's greatest unsolved mysteries. Three main theories dominate the discussion. Theory 1. Suicide in the wilderness. Proponents of this theory point to Xavier's final movements. He was last seen in Roquebrune-sur-Argens, near vast forested regions. He'd purchased camping equipment. He'd written what appeared to be farewell letters to relatives, strange rambling messages about his Catholic faith and his failures. Perhaps, having committed the unthinkable, Xavier walked into the forest with his rifle and ended his own life. His body, they argue, could easily have been consumed by wildlife, covered by vegetation, or simply overlooked in the massive terrain. The lack of any financial activity, any digital footprint, any confirmed sightings in over a decade all support this theory. Dead men leave no traces. Theory 2. Successful escape and new identity. This theory suggests Xavier executed a carefully planned disappearance. He'd researched how to vanish, how to create false identities. His aristocratic background gave him connections across Europe and beyond. Supporters point to the meticulous nature of the crime. A man capable of such planning could surely arrange a new identity and safe haven. Perhaps he's living in South America under an assumed name, working cash jobs, staying off the grid. Some even speculate he underwent cosmetic surgery to alter his appearance, explaining why facial recognition and public sightings have yielded nothing. Theory 3. Protected by others. The darkest theory suggests Xavier didn't act alone in his escape. Perhaps family members, old friends, or religious contacts have sheltered him, moving him between safe houses, providing financial support. This theory is supported by the seeming impossibility of one man vanishing so completely. Modern surveillance, digital tracking, and international cooperation make disappearing extraordinarily difficult. Unless you have help. Investigators have never publicly confirmed or denied this theory, but questions about potential accomplices linger. Whatever theory you believe, one thing is certain. 5 innocent people are dead, and their killer has never faced justice. Stay with us as we close this case with some final thoughts. The Dupont de Ligons case has left deep scars on France. It's become a cultural touchstone, referenced in films, books, and television shows. The phrase L'affaire Dupont de Ligons is instantly recognizable to most French citizens. For the extended family, the horror is twofold. The loss of Agnes and the 4 children, and the knowledge that Xavier, their relative, is responsible. Some family members have spoken publicly about their anguish, their inability to comprehend how someone they knew could commit such evil. The children's friends, now adults, still carry the trauma. They've spoken in interviews about the normalcy of those last days, the ordinary conversations, the complete absence of warning signs. Criminologists and psychologists have studied Xavier extensively. He fits the profile of a family annihilator, a specific type of killer who murders their own family and then either commits suicide or flees. These cases are rare but not unknown. They typically involve financial ruin, shame, and a narcissistic inability to face failure. What makes Xavier's case unique is the apparent success of his escape. Most family annihilators either kill themselves immediately or are caught within days. Xavier planned differently. In 2024, French authorities announced they were using new artificial intelligence and facial recognition technology to search through global databases of unidentified persons, missing people, and even the dead. The hope is that somewhere, in some database, Xavier's face will appear. The Nantes community has never forgotten. A memorial was erected for Agnes, Arthur, Thomas, and Benoit. Every year on the anniversary of their discovery, flowers appear at the site. The house on Rue de l'Erdre was eventually sold. New owners moved in, though the property's dark history is impossible to escape. Some say it's haunted not by ghosts, but by the weight of what happened there. Nantes, France, a quiet city in western France, where 5 people were murdered by the person who should have loved them most, where a father became a monster, where a family was erased from existence in the middle of the night. Xavier Dupont de Ligons, if you're still alive, if you're listening, know this, you are not forgotten. The faces of your wife and children stare out from wanted posters across the world. Their memory demands justice. For the investigators who continue to pursue this case, for the family and friends left behind, and for all of us who believe that evil should not go unpunished, the search continues. One day, whether in this life or whatever comes after, Xavier Dupont de Ligons will answer for what he did on Rue de l'Erdre. If this case has gripped you the way it's gripped investigators for over a decade, share this story. Keep the pressure on. Keep the search alive. Because somewhere, somehow, the truth has a way of emerging from even the darkest places. Until that day, the Dupont de Ligons disappearance remains one of the most chilling unsolved cases in modern history. A reminder that sometimes the greatest monsters don't lurk in dark alleys or abandoned buildings. Sometimes they sleep in the room next door.